Good afternoon or good morning to everyone who's joining us from the West Coast. Welcome and thank you all for tuning in. We're excited to have you. I'm Anna Soslova. I'm on the field marketing team here at Cybereason. Before I hand it over to our presenter, Moore, who will be talking about Operation Soft Cell, I wanted to remind everyone that you are on mute. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can ask them in the question section. If Moore doesn't get to your question, we'll follow up via email shortly afterward. I'll also be sending a recording of the session to everyone in a follow-up email. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Moore Levy, the Vice President of Security Practices at Cybereason. Moore has over 8 years of experience in cyber investigations, incident responses, as well as SIM and SOC management. So now over to you, Moore.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you everyone who's joining us for our webinar. So in today's webinar, we'll actually divide it into two major parts. The first part will talk about a little bit of background on the telco industry, the attack itself and its impact, what is CDR or call data records data, and what is the importance of it or the impact for it for a telco, and then we'll drill down into the attack details. In the second part, we'll focus more on the tools and their TTPs that were used as part of this attack. What was our threat intelligence methodology and threat hunting? Which MITRE attack techniques were used as part of this attack? And eventually, we'll talk about some high-level security recommendations that we've got from this campaign and this attack. So let's start. First and foremost, let's talk about the background. So critical infrastructure in general is a highly valuable target to threat actors, and specifically to nation-state threat actors. And this could go to an act of war and other things, but just think about it, why critical infrastructure is such a high valuable target. If we drill down specifically to telcos, the telecommunication market has quadrupled in the last 13 years, meaning that the telco market has been growing dramatically in the past years and putting it into focus for different threat actors. Specifically around telcos, there are 8 billion subscribers as we speak. This means that it's almost the entire Earth population that is subscribed to telcos, meaning that each and every one of us could be threatened when a telco is breached. Telcos are now considered critical infrastructures as part of the Homeland Security and Department of Defense in the US, and we will talk about why telco infrastructure is considered critical infrastructure, because it's not necessarily always trivial to think about telco as critical infrastructure as we think about the national grid or water pumps and all that other stuff. So now let's drill down a little bit into the attack and the impact. This attack that we've seen is a multi-year, multi-stage attack that happened in the past 2 years and even more from some evidences that we have. And it corresponds to a nation-state Chinese threat actor. Our solution was able to detect several pieces of the attack and enable us to do the full scope of the investigation. The MDR team supported the customer, and we leveraged our experience by supporting the customer and working directly with him as part of the forensic and incident response investigation. The impact of this attack is, first and foremost, is risk of people's life as part of their data being stolen from the CDR. Second, which is also super important, is the business disruption for those companies, which is a huge business disruption. And we will drill down into this business disruption when we'll talk about the attack itself. And the third piece, which is not minor at all, is the operational cost to fix the infrastructure. And we're saying fix is not that the attackers caused damage as part of their attack, is the fact that they were able to infiltrate the infrastructure and were able to do lateral movement and other things in that network caused huge damage that in order to fix it and to remediate this problem has a huge operational cost while those companies are in business. So before we drill down into the attack, let's talk about what is the end goal of the attackers when they were breaching to those companies, to those telco companies. Every telco companies has data that is called CDR, call detail records. Those call detail records are actually our metadata of the calls that we're doing, and they're including the date of the call, the time of the call duration, the originating number and the terminating number, IMEI number, which is a unique identifier for your phone, and CI, which is cell site identity number. Now, by having those details on an individual, an attacker could take this data from the CDR database and put it into another database or a BI platform that they're using as attackers. And then they can actually build the daily patterns of the same individual or individuals that they're actually tracking. So for example, we have this picture here as an example. By taking those logs, the attackers can actually understand where is their victim is located during business hours because of the cell site identity number and its location, and where they are located during their non-business hours. From here, you can draw many conclusions of the type of the data and the consequences of having such data for a nation state could have. As you understand, the reason we're mentioning that this is a nation state because the amount of data that was stolen was pretty big. It was hundreds of gigabytes. But on the other hand, the individuals that were targeted, it wasn't like the entire database was stolen and all of the subscribers of those companies were affected. There are only specific individuals that were affected as part of this breach, a small number of individuals. And that's why we think that this is a nation state behind it. Now let's drill down into the attack. So the attack, the main thing about it is that this was a low and under the radar kind of attack, and it was slow. You need a lot of patience in order to be able to connect all the dots and all the puzzle pieces of this attack. And we will go through this high-level overview and we'll drill down. So as you can see, the attack started between 2018 to 2019. The first wave started after we were deployed for this one specific company, but we are assuming that the attack started at least 1 year prior to our deployment. And in some cases, we even think that it's more than 1 year and could date back to 7 years back. So we had the first wave since our deployment. Then 2 months passed. We had the second, the third, and the fourth. And we will now drill down into each one of those phases, and we'll talk about their technical aspects, what happened there, and also one of the many questions that comes up is what happened that you gave it as a vendor to go through those 4 waves. How weren't you able to stop it, to prevent it, and so on? We'll also address that question that comes up pretty often. All right, so let's start with the first wave. As I mentioned, the time of the beginning of the attack prior our deployment is unknown to us still, but our timer starts since we were deployed. So this is like time 0. Since we were deployed, we had 48 hours and our SOC started to monitor this environment. And we had, after 48 hours, we have what we called first mallup to being triggered. So the mallup that was triggered by our platform was a mallup for web shell activity on IIS and Exchange production server. And the second mallup that was triggered was a remote execution tool, a known remote execution tool. As part of our investigation efforts, we were able to uncover reconnaissance activities that happens and originate from the web shell, and leveraging a tool called NBT scan in order to scan the network. It leverages the NetBIOS protocol, and by doing so, it's actually able to reveal additional machines that are available to remote login. And we also identified credential stealing of password hashes, NTLM hashes. As part of our investigation, at the beginning, there were a few indicators that suggested that this is a nation state attack, but there were also indicators that suggested that this could be a very sophisticated cybercrime group. So it was hard to attribute back then to which threat actor is behind it, but we realized that this is something serious. Then this was escalated to the Nocturnus research team, which I lead. And we started to open this investigation a bit more broadly and to dig a little bit deeper around all the TTPs and the affected machines. We started to scope the affected machines and users and the compromised machines, as well as the tools that's being used in this phase one. And by that, we kept monitoring those tools and machines to see if anything else happens. After that, we've provided this specific company an incident report, that correlates the detected web shell to China Chopper web shell. And we also did some containment actions with the customer, like prevent some hashes from running, isolate some machines, kill some processes. We blacklisted some of the IOCs as part of the continuous monitoring of the things that we've identified as part of the investigation. And that was it. It seems like everything stopped. It looked like the thing that they were after was the web shell to steal some credentials, and that's it. Nothing happens. This investigation took a few days. Then, after 2 months, we actually saw that something again is happening in the environment. This time, it wasn't so loud as the first wave. We had a few indicators in our platform saying that something is going on, but it wasn't as loud as the initial wave. In this case, what our platform identified is the execution of Mimikatz variant, and we were able to block it. So we, got in there again, started our investigation again, and then we realized that the attackers tried to run Mimikatz again, but because it was prevented, they decided that they need to change their specific tool or the specific variant of Mimikatz that they're running. So after a few attempts, they were still able to dump the credentials. As part of our investigation, we've identified another modified version of China Chopper, of the web shell, on another server. We also identified the creation of several accounts by the attackers, which had elevated privileges. We identified reconnaissance, again, running NBT scan and other tools, which we already blacklisted. And we have identified small amounts of data exfiltration by Poison Ivy, HTRAN, and the web shells. Here again, we did the containment actions. And keep in mind, when you do containment actions, it's something very surgical, and it's not solving the entire problem. And we'll talk about it when we get to the fourth wave. In any case, in here, we added some more hashes to our prevention capabilities. We provided the customer with IP addresses to block. We blacklisted IOCs, and again, we continued monitoring. So in this phase, the TTPs were pretty similar. There was a bit small modifications of the tools, but at the end of the day, the patterns are pretty similar from what the attackers did in the first wave. Then after 3 months, we had the third wave being detected. Again, we had another variant of a web shell, but in this case, now we saw that from this web shell, the attackers are starting to be a bit more aggressive. They ran user enumeration commands. They gained domain admin and actually dumped the entire domain controller. They did lateral movement within the environment, leveraging WMI and PSXX. And they also tried to exfiltrate some data by leveraging HTRAN. So some of the data that they were able to exfiltrate in the second attempt, if I'm not mistaken, some credentials of more high privilege users. And in this third attempt, some of the CNC servers of them were already blocked by the company. So they needed to rebuild another CNC server and to exfiltrate that server. So again, we did the same thing. Then after 1 month, that's when the final piece of the puzzle got connected, and everything was clear to us to understand what actually happened as part of this attack. So in the fourth wave, we identified the same tools but different IOCs. As I said, again, they modified the tools. And what we've identified as well is that the attackers created a VPN access using soft ether VPN to access the network and to exfiltrate the data, meaning that the attackers got tired from creating more and more web shells in order to get into the network. So they decided to set up their own VPN in that network. Again, they did Active Directory enumerations, but here we also figure out that they're actually exfiltrating 100 gigabytes of CDR data per session. So here we realized, once we realized that the data is actually CDR data, we realized that this is a nation state threat actor and not just any cybercrime. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how did you get to a point that all those fourth waves happening and the attackers still have access and you're not blocking them? So what I can say is that we did a lot of surgical prevention and containment actions, but in order to completely block the attackers from getting into the network, this company needed to completely rebuild their IT infrastructure because, as we said, the attackers were there even prior to our arrival. And also keep in mind that if a nation state is attacking you, they're very determined and they're stubborn. They won't just leave once you block something. As I mentioned, we blocked several CNC servers. They set up a new server. We blocked some of their web shells and their Mimikatz attempts. They created new variants. So keep in mind that nation state threat actors are very sophisticated and they're very determined. They're not going to give up so fast unless you're going to do something super dramatic in the environment, which couldn't happen in this case because this is a business, and to completely rebuild this IT infrastructure has huge cost, as we talked about, but also have a direct business impact on the day-to-day. Do we have any questions?
So we just had a question come in about that. Can you define what exactly you mean by rebuilt their infrastructure?
Yes. So what I'm saying is that at the end of the day, from seeing those 4 waves of attack and investigating how deep they got in, it means that they needed to completely repatch and to wipe all of their internet-facing servers. They needed to completely rebuild their domain controllers and to make sure that every single one of the machines in their environment is not affected by the attackers, which is hard to tell because there are several thousands, if not more than thousands, of servers and endpoints that you need to investigate and completely verify that they are not affected. As I mentioned, the attackers did a lot of lateral movement and credential stealing, so the list of impacted machines and users is endless, as well as after they dumped completely the Active Directory, it means that all of the users are compromised, meaning that they needed to disable all those users, clean all those machines, all of their machines, repatch their environment, building additional protection layers from a network perspective and segmentation, and only then to create, again, those users. So this is a lot of operational work from an IT perspective while you're running a business. So I hope this answers the question. Are there any more questions as we go, or?
So there was one question earlier. Are the variants of Mimikatz identified by hash or by behavior and analysis of the API usage?
So the Mimikatz variants were identified by the Next-Gen AV machine learning engine. So basically by the properties of this specific variant. I hope this helps. All right, let's move on. So we talked a little bit about the breakdown of the attack. Now we can drill down into the tools specifically that were used, and maybe this can also answer the IOC question that comes up every once in a while. So I hope I will be able to answer you with some of the IOC questions by talking about the tools and also which patterns you should hunt for if you're a telco, or generally speaking, which patterns are interesting for the tools that has been used. All right, so the first tool that we've identified was the China Chopper Web Shell Malp. This was the regular version of China Chopper. And what we've identified is that, sorry, it was the modified version. Sorry, I'm mixed up. What we've identified is that the web shell is actually executing a remote shell and starting to run recon commands. We know that China Chopper was previously used and attributed to Chinese threat actors, numerous threat actors, APT10, APT27, APT3, and others. So there are many Chinese threat actors and others that can leverage this tool, and that's why the attribution is not necessarily accurate for a specific APT group, but we do think that this is a Chinese threat actor behind that. So what we saw as part of the web shell, and this was the initial web shell, is web process, the W3WP, which is the IAS process, running a command, which eventually running other recon commands like find, ipconfig, netstat, whoami, and others, just to understand on which machine they're running, what is the network configuration of that machine, started to look for specific users and specific files and all that stuff. And that was the initial tool that was used. So if you're asking yourself, okay, what can I learn from this, or which TTPs I can look for, I would suggest starting by looking at web processes that spawning shells. That will be a good start. Then we had another version of NBT scan. So as I mentioned earlier, NBT scan is a tool that identified NetBIOS name servers and system information. It's also being used for reconnaissance. And yet again, this is another tool that is attributed to Chinese threat actors, and among them there is APT10. And NBT scan is a tool that you can find online and actually get all of the information around that. Another tool that was identified is modified Mimikatz version. So in this case, there were no command line arguments in order to avoid detection. So this wasn't an interactive shell of Mimikatz, but it was a bit of a modified version that once you run it, it dumps the NTLM hashes automatically. This was initially blocked by the NextGen AV, as I mentioned, and later we identified that this is Mimikatz. Obviously, there were no any indicators from a metadata perspective or behavioral perspective that this is Mimikatz necessarily, but when we reversed the tool, it was easy for us to identify that this is a modified version of Mimikatz. In addition to that, the attackers leveraged PowerShell-based Mimikatz to dump the credentials of other machines. So that was another tool and TTP that the attackers leveraged. They actually used whatever they can to dump credentials all over the place. And yet another credential dumping. So as you can see, the attackers, and you'll see it a bit later more, the attackers leveraged a lot of lol bins, living off the land binaries, as part of their credential stealing and lateral movement. In this example, we have the reg.exe process that the attackers used in order to dump the SAM hive, which contains password hashes, which eventually you can translate them by rainbow tables and other stuff that you guys probably heard about previously. Lateral movement was done by leveraging WMI and PSExec. And the attackers leveraged that in order to install additional tools across multiple assets and actually to compromise additional machines as they go into the depths of the network, of the IT network of the company, and eventually into the operational network, the CDR network. And they leveraged that in order to compromise critical assets like production servers, DB servers, and obviously they got full access of the domain controller. So in here, you can see an example of a command that was leveraged by WMI in order to move laterally between the Exchange server, to the Exchange server and everything was done by the authentication mechanism that you can add as arguments to the WMI command. And those credentials were stolen as part of the previous work of credential stealing and lateral movement. Another tool, one of the main tools that were used, is poison ivy. So in our case, in the platform, the way that we've identified poison ivy is that we've identified the loading of, or DLL side loading of SSMUI DLL, which is a DLL that is being leveraged by Samsung. RunHelp is a Samsung tool, and the SSMUI DLL is a legit DLL that is being used by Samsung. But what the attackers did, they just renamed their PyV payload with the name of the DLL that the RunHelp tool is loading, and by that they were able to load PyV as part of a legitimate process. So in here we can see that this was also done as part of a service, meaning from a persistence perspective. And this was previously, so the service was either created by WMI or PsExec, and then the service is running the RunHelp, in which in the folder from which it loads the DLLs, it had the malicious DLL of PyV. Another LOLBIN tool that the attackers used is certutil. So in this case, they leveraged certutil as a downloader. It is a legitimate tool that manages certificates on Windows. But what the attackers did, because this tool has a command line tool that enables it to have internet access and download data, so the attackers just used that in order to download additional tools and files from their remote CNC server. In the secondary web shells that we saw, we saw a bit of a custom web shell that was deployed. Yet again, the attackers launched recon commands, they stole data, and they dropped tools like port query, renamed CMD, WinRAR, and HTRAN. So in this example, you can see that they're running a WMI command. They're running NSLOOKUP and ping for doing recon, and they're running HTRAN, approximately what we think is to connect to one of the CDR machines via RDP port. Eventually, the attackers used WinRAR as their exfiltration tool, or as their compressing tool to exfiltrate the data. So what they did, the attackers leveraged the modified named version of CMD to CDM, and they used WinRAR in order to compress the CDR data, and they put a password to protect it. They moved the data to the recycle bin, and then they just fragmented the data to several archives and then exfiltrated it. So we were actually able to see the exfiltration commands and the password to those files, and we were able to pinpoint exactly where the exfiltrated data is and where they should look for and what is the data holds. Another tool is HTRAN. HTRAN is the tool that the attackers used in order to communicate between the CDR network or the operational network into the IT network. Usually, the CDR network or the operational network is either air-gapped or highly segmented than the rest of the network. So a tool like HTRAN was actually able to take some data from the operational network and to bounce it back into the IT network, and from there to exfiltrate the data. And that's exactly what they did. So at the end of the day, this tool redirects ports and connection between networks, and it also obfuscates the C2 traffic. And this is another tool that is highly used by Chinese threat actors. Now we can talk about the MITRE attack techniques that were used. So as you can see, the MITRE attack techniques are across the board. meaning that we can see almost every phase of the attack that happened here. And also we have several TTPs. So for the initial access, we had exploit of public-facing application. In the execution phase, we had command line interface, WMI, PowerShell. As a persistence, we had both web shell and account creation. We had privilege escalation of valid accounts and leveraging web shells. From a defense evasion perspective, we had DLL side loading, indicator removal from tools, obfuscated files, masquerading, and more. So if you actually want to drill down into each one of those techniques, first you can go back in the presentation in which we will share with you, and you can look on each one of the tools, and you can even try to tie them back to those TTPs. And you can also press the link and get more information from the MITRE website. Do we have questions so far?
So a question that came up was, have you been able to find the vulnerability that allowed this attack to happen in the first place?
So for us, we're not a vulnerability management tool or a company. What we saw was the behavior of an exploitation of an internet-facing web server. So for all we know, any type of vulnerable version for a web server could be exploited. This was not a 0 day, if this is the question.
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
All right, cool. Let's talk a little bit about the methodology for doing the threat hunting and the threat research. So initially, in the first wave, we had a list of IOCs and TTPs. We took those IOCs and TTPs. Some of them we've created as blacklist or custom rules, and others we just hunted for them across our customer base and online, basically. And then we started to attribute and to look what is the different threat actors' arsenal, which threat actors are using what tools and all that. And by doing that, we started to build a behavioral profile of each one of the threat actors that we suspected them. Then we moved forward from that behavioral profile. We continued with the hunting that included the behavioral profile with tuning it to specific TTPs and IOCs that we saw as part of the attack and what we read online, of course. And then we were able to reveal additional suspect and additional data that is relevant. Now, in addition to the threat hunting and research and incident response that happened as part of this specific investigation, we also did a threat intelligence research that included looking for such indicators online. And by doing so, we were able actually to expose several other companies that were not our customers that were also affected by the same threat actor. We were able to identify the same tools that were used in other attacks on other companies. And if you want, we can drill down a little bit about that. But that is the final slide almost. Before recommendations, are there any questions?
Another question that came in was, did you share this with the telcos that were affected?
Yes, so it's actually a good question, and I forgot to mention it. We shared all of our findings and all the companies that we've identified as being affected by this campaign. We shared it with all the companies directly. We contacted them. We gave them a full detailed report from what we know because we're looking from the outside. And we did that several months before the publication of this entire campaign. So the answer is yes.
Another question is, understanding CDR was exfiltrated, what is or was the risk to cellular network in this attack and compromise or misuse of network?
So in this specific case, the attacker's goal was around the CDR data, but because they got so deep into the network and actually owned the IT network as well as the CDR network, they could do whatever they want. So the consequences of such access to a telco could be anything. They could do whatever they want. If they wanted to shut down the cell towers, they could do that because they were already in. but their goal was around data of specific individuals. And this attack purpose specifically was around low and slow and probably more of an espionage act, or more of an intelligence act rather than creating damage or something like that.
And another related question is, was the cellular gateway compromised?
So it's hard for us to know if the gateway itself was compromised, but what we saw is that by leveraging access from specific machines in the IT network that have access both to the IT network and to the cellular network, that's how the attackers got in. So from my assumption, it seems like the gateway was not breached, but the attackers got in from a different angle.
Thank you. And before we move on to recommendations, another question is, I understand there's about 50 countries that have been affected. Does this include the United States?
So we talked about companies that work from a global perspective almost across the world. The continents that we've mentioned are Europe, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. So from all we know so far, there are no affected companies or companies that operate in the US, but keep in mind that all telcos have some kind of collaboration with other telcos from a cellular perspective infrastructure. So even if one company operates only in the US, but they have some kind of infrastructure sharing with another company that operates in one of the continents that I just mentioned, it's possible. Now, we're also seeing almost every day new findings because we're tracking this campaign worldwide. So we're seeing more indicators and more companies that are being exposed as part of this campaign. So for now, no, there are no companies in the US or the Americas region that were affected, but this is right for today.
Great, thank you.
Cool. So the last slide before we move on to more questions is very high level recommendations. And if you have more questions around the recommendations, we can drill down to that as well. And our recommendations is, first and foremost, you need to validate that your infrastructure is clean. And the way to do that is to proactively hunt. In addition to that, if you have any internet-facing assets like web servers, email servers, that they are exposed at the end of the day, try to add as many security layers as possible and try to segregate them from an architectural perspective from the internal network, meaning put them in a DMZ, which is segregated, and there are many approaches to that. If you decide to do hunting, we are recommending you, specifically around the TTPs of this campaign, is to hunt first for servers that share services like email and web, but also they're internet facing. That will probably be the entry point for attackers. And in addition to that, if you're going to hunt, do a hunting in your operational network and also closely monitor users and machines that have access to both networks, the operational network and the IT network. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Mor. Yeah, we had a lot of questions come in. The most common one is, why didn't you release the IOCs for this attack?
So this, again, a question that's being asked multiple times. And the reason for it, there are several reasons for it. The first one, as we mentioned, is risk of people's lives. So you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, why releasing IOCs can risk someone's life? The reason for it is because this campaign is super targeted, and the individuals and the companies that were impacted are very targeted. The attackers build an infrastructure that is bound into servers and hashes that they are dedicated per company, per victim, the company that they are targeting. So one, by releasing those IOCs, someone can reveal which companies were impacted. By revealing the companies that were impacted, this could cause First of all, from a legal perspective, that's just wrong to expose companies like that with their name. And the second thing is this could make the attackers do a move on those people or those individuals that their data is stolen, and now they can decide, okay, our operation is exposed, so we need to move fast. We can't keep collecting data and all that stuff. So that's the main reason that we didn't release the IOCs. And the secondary reason for it is those companies' reputation. It should be their decision to expose themselves, and we shouldn't be the ones that are exposing them.
Another question is, why did your team let the attack get as far as wave 4? Shouldn't your solution prevent that?
So as I explained earlier, the reason for that is because first and foremost, we did surgical actions in order to prevent things without impacting the business. And also, as I mentioned, this is a nation-state threat actor. So in order to prevent their access completely, something dramatic needed to happen in the IT network. An example for it could be to put several additional protection layers for all of the internet-facing assets. Another example for it could be to completely rebuild all of the infrastructure with other companies that this specific company had M&A with them. Another example for this is to completely rebuild the Active Directory of those companies. And from a prevention perspective, keep in mind that this is an interactive attack. When there is an interactive attacker, it's not just a malware, which is one tool that you stop. It means that there is someone behind the keyboard that's actually running commands, and they're testing us. They're seeing what is being stopped, what is being detected, and they're changing their MO. That's why this operation took them so long. And that's why there are gaps in the times between the different waves, because they wanted people to be a bit sloppy. You can't be always on guard because then you burn out really fast. But for the attackers, they have time. So that's maybe a little bit about how such attacks and threat actors as nation states, it's not something that you prevent necessarily like malware or commodity malware.
Great. So we have time for one or two more questions. Another question is, the attack didn't involve a zero-date exploit or any new tools. Is this attack likely to happen for other telecommunication providers or organizations?
So the answer is yes. It didn't involve a zero-day exploit, but it could happen to any telco. And from my experience, many companies don't have the recent patches on all of their machines and servers and internet-facing assets. So this could happen to anyone in which their patch management is not the recent and the latest. And even if your patch management is the recent and the latest, there are other ways to get in. The attackers could send a phishing email that someone eventually will click on it, and then they can move from there. The attackers, if this is a nation state, they can also have physical access. So keep in mind there's no bulletproof solution for those things, and there's more than one way to get in.
Okay, great. Last question. Are there any more signs of the threat actor revisiting the affected telco after the fourth wave?
So we're suspecting that the answer is yes. We had recent evidences for it in the past few weeks, but we still need to verify that data to see if this is the same threat actor or someone else, because it also could be someone opportunistic that is leveraging the situation.
Thank you, Mor, and thank you all for joining. As I mentioned earlier, if we didn't get to your question, we'll follow up shortly. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to hello@cybereason.com. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.